Attention!
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to Issues in Focus.
Well, autumn is a time when we think about sports, particularly in Japan. There's even a national holiday in October dedicated to sports. And recently, very near us here at NHK, there was a World Sports Fair, the World Sports Fair 83, and I'm holding the program here, and you can see it's a very glossy program introducing a very glossy series of sporting events. Now, looking through this program, one of the things that we noticed was that not only are the names of international athletes and Japanese athletes who took part in the sporting events given prominence, but right here you can also see a list of the companies who were sponsoring these events. And it's a very long list, and these sponsors are really being given equal prominence with the names of the athletes. It really does read like an index of advertisers. And again, if we turn over the page, we'll see that some of the individual events too, not only the whole program, but some of the individual events, were also sponsored by individual commercial enterprises. And we've picked them out there for you in green so that you can see them a little more clearly. Well, flicking through the program, Peggy, it does really look as though sports have become big business. Would you say that was an accurate description?
There's a great deal of money involved in sports, both as an activity that people learn and do, and also as a way for companies to sponsor, to get their name before audiences, to sponsor their products.
The sports have become certainly very commercialized, and here in the program it's not only companies that make and sell sporting goods that sponsor the events, but also food companies, companies from all sorts of other areas. I think you have a chart there which tells us something about the popularity of sports in relation to this big business aspect.
Well, this chart shows retail sales of sporting equipment between 1976 and 1982. And you'll notice the millions of yen that are involved in these retail sales. Of course, we have to take into consideration inflation, but still more and more people are purchasing sporting goods.
Well, sports are not only business then, they're very big business. And
I wonder if we really use all of this equipment and sporting goods.
We may just like the little names that appear on our T-shirts. I haven't got one, but many people have. Looking forward to 1984, which, as everybody knows, of course, is an Olympic year, and the 1984 Olympics are scheduled to be held in Los Angeles. Well, now in the press, both in Japan and in other countries, these Olympics are already being called the most commercialized Olympics in history. And it does seem that a lot more of the money involved in mounting the Olympics this year is coming from private sponsors, from the same sort of commercial enterprises that have been sponsoring the sporting events that I showed you the program of earlier.
Of course, when I think of the Olympics, I think of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. I think it's fresh in many people's minds. Of course, this was a case of when many of the participating nations, such as the United States, boycotted the Olympics in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, many of the contestants from nations like Britain participated as individuals, not on a national team. So we have the problem of sports being impinged upon by the political events.
Right, well, today's program is going to focus on the problem of pressures on athletes which come from outside the sport. Big business pressures, commercial pressures, pressures to win, and political pressures. Peggy, you mentioned the Olympics, and those Moscow Olympics were not the first in which political pressures had played a very big part in the way in which those Olympics hit the news. We'd like to begin by looking back at the history of some of the recent Olympics and at the extent to which politics has entered them and spoilt that Olympic ideal that they are supposed to uphold. The first film we'd like to look at is some newsreel clip from the Berlin Olympics. Now, this took place in 1936, and it was widely seen as an opportunity for Hitler, and here we see him, in fact, opening the Berlin Olympics, to show off his form of government and the Germany that his form of government wanted to suggest was superior to all the other forms of government in the world. And in fact, the 1936 Berlin Olympics became a massive propaganda exercise. To some extent, Hitler's purpose was to show that the white race, the Aryan race, which of course included his Germans, the Germans of his new fascist state, were superior, not only politically and as races, but as athletes. And so he's right.
Here we have a blonde Aryan representing Hitler's ideal, bringing the Olympic torch into the stadium.
Yeah, and of course that Olympic torch is meant to be a symbol of unity, fairness, and equality in the world.
Well, when a black American, Jesse Owens, won this track event, in fact, he won 3 other gold medals, it was, in a sense, a small victory for the voices against racism,
Indeed.
against Nazism.
There we see Hitler reacting to it. Peggy, I would say it was a large victory. Switching the scene to the Mexico Olympics, which took place in 1968, we were here faced with a situation where political events marred the Olympics in a number of different ways. First of all, we have here some film of student riots which were taking place in Mexico City, the same venue as the Olympics, and these were in the news at the same time as the Olympics were, drawing political attention to Moscow. Here, 15 countries are organizing or attempting to organize a boycott against the Olympics because of the inclusion of athletes from South Africa. And of course here, the tanks are the tanks of the Soviet Union, shortly before the Olympics, invading Czechoslovakia in 1968, shortly after the Prague Spring.
Well, in the end, the South African team was disqualified from joining these 1968 Olympics.
And I think here, on the subject of Czechoslovakia, we see the Czech team, which did attend the Olympics, being greeted as they enter the Olympic Stadium with a massive ovation. Great applause from the spectators as a gesture of solidarity, of course, not only with them as athletes, but with their government in facing the Soviet Union. So again, political issues were to the fore.
Again, American athletes were in the news. Tommy Smith, the winner of this 200-meter dash, and his teammate demonstrated their opposition to racial discrimination on the winning platform.
And they do this by raising their hands in what has become universally recognized as a black solidarity salute. And this again became not only an individual athlete's gesture, but to some extent a political gesture.
Then we turn to the Munich Olympics in 1972.
And what a tragedy that was. Here, again, it wasn't a government involvement, but again, politically, a group of Arab terrorists held hostage a number of Israeli athletes who were representing their country as sportsmen at this Olympics and turned them into what amounted to political guinea pigs.
Police laid their plans well, but hung back through the day. Dietrich Genscher established contact with the group, so did the Munich chief of police and an official of the Olympic Village.
In the end, 11 Israeli athletes died in this incident.
Well, this was, I think, one of the greatest tragedies to affect the Olympic movement. It wasn't one that governments could easily control. It was a group of individual terrorists seizing on the opportunity presented by a peaceful sporting event to make a political statement that had these tragic consequences that we see. Now we move to what you mentioned earlier, Peggy, the Moscow Olympics, fresh in everybody's minds. And shortly before them, of course, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and many countries, with America under President Carter in the lead, countries including Japan, decided that this was sufficient reason to boycott the Olympics. We're looking at American athletes who had been preparing for years for these Olympics, for their moment of glory, and not being able to go after all.
I firmly believe that with all its imperfections, sport is the greatest unifying influence there is in this world today, and it is wrong to use sport as an instrument for political manoeuvring. A British government cannot take away from any individual his or her entitlement, and they will not stop people going to the Olympic Games to participate in the Olympic Games, at least not at the moment, but they will not give any special privileges.
Well, of course, governments have their opinions, committees have their opinions, and individual sportsmen have their opinions too about whether or not they should participate in sporting events that come under these kinds of political cloud. Now, recently, the Oxford and Cambridge rugby teams were here on a tour of Japan, and we took the opportunity to ask the two international players who were with these teams their opinion of the Moscow boycott. We asked Hugh Davis, who is the standoff for Cambridge and England, and Hugo McNeill, who's the fullback for Oxford and Ireland, exactly how they felt about the boycott at Moscow.
The last Olympics in Moscow in 1980 followed close on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and therefore those Olympics were disrupted to an extent that most other Olympics have not been by the boycotts of various countries. That Olympics seemed to demonstrate to a lot of people anyway that the Olympic ideals, that really the ideals that you're suggesting ought to hold, that sport is beyond political and moral considerations, and a sportsman's real responsibility is only to his sport. Those Olympics in Moscow did seem to suggest that those ideals are really no longer possible in the complex, politically structured world we live in. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think obviously that is true. I mean, as you say, the ideals of the Olympics are... I mean, I would think that never again will you have the sort of Olympics, the ideals that we saw, say, in the 30s, 40s, 50s. But I think from a sportsman's point of view, I mean, that is tremendously sad, and I think all sportsmen would, you know, in their heart of hearts, would love it to get back to those old ideals, and obviously certain sportsmen retain the hope that it'll eventually get back to that state. But that's how it is.
Hugo, how do you feel about the Moscow Olympics?
Well, I agree that it's sad when the ideals that we value have to be modified, and when sport is brought in. But I think we also have to be realistic. I mean, I think in the case of the Moscow Olympics, it's very sad that what happened. But following on and what happened in Afghanistan, where one country had invaded and taken over another country, I mean, to immediately participate afterwards in what was going to be used as a vast propaganda exercise, and there's no argument by the Soviet government, it was with the Moscow Olympics, would, I think, be a dangerously weak attitude to adopt.
As we've just heard, Hugh Davis hopes that sports in the Olympics can somehow remain isolated from world problems. On the other hand, Hugo McNeill believes that athletes, in a sense, represent their nations. And at some point, when their nations take a stand, athletes, too, must make a political statement. Of course, as long as the Olympics are organized around national teams, it seems to me that there's always going to be a political use put to the spectacle of the Olympics on television.
Well,